I'm Don Logan. I live right here originally from Lancaster, Kentucky. In 1973, I moved over here and married my wife, Betsy Lackey. Well, my interest took place in '73, and as I hung around here and hunted these hollers and read about the history, then I realized this had to be it, but I had no way of knowing. And then back in 2000, there was a gentleman come in here and asked permission to walk the trace. He had the maps to prove where it went. And it come up across by Eagles Landing, come right down this, where you see it now, and on down across the crossing there. And I thought that was an awful good road for a farm road. No farmers had a road that good. And and then I read about where it was supposed to be so far up from Hart's Fork. And that just about sealed it. It had to be the way in. If you look up and down Hayes Fork Creek, there are bluffs, and there are no other crossing. When I found the two-bit going, my brother and I was hunting arrowheads in a tobacco patch in the early spring, after the patch had been worked up. And this two-bit piece will land on top of the ground shining like new money. That's how I managed to find it.
What was special about that piece?
So it's quartered up.
I mean, what numbers?
It was cut between the 1700 and the later date. So the coin was minted in 1700 something.
So that's a 1700s
coin.
Mm-hmm. Found on
Spanish silver dollar, right?
It's got to be pretty strong indication, not 100%.
It was early.
This was the Boone trade.
Right, it was early.
Okay.
How long they stayed in circulation, but how many of them have you ever seen?
And in this particular location.
Right, period.
Yeah, almost got to be.
So what did y'all think about that day, like when you come up on it? Like, what is that?
I didn't know for sure, really. I knew what it was when I'd seen it, but I didn't know for sure it was what the story was behind it. So I got shown it to people.
So how long have you known this road has been here?
Probably since about 77, 78. I thought it was it, till a gentleman come here and asked permission to walk it. And other than that, I have no way of myself even proving it was it. I don't guess
nobody does.
Nobody has.
100%.
100%, right.
To be aligned here
right.
with the coin and
right.
millstone. And
but if you walk up this creek, up down this creek, you can realize about the only place they could have been across it.
That's another strong piece.
Right.
You can kind of look at the
right.
topography and figure out they had to go through here.
Right.
You ever walk up through here late one night or early one morning and think what it was like back in 1700?
I sit on my back porch and think about that all the time, about my own ancestors coming down this holler.
Right down this very road.
Right. The hundreds of people come down this holler. And how many people probably buried around these fields you didn't even know about? What's the first year y'all think Boone come through here?
When did he come?
He was originally in here in 1760. That was mainly over near Stanford.
Danny Boone, he and Henderson decided where they were going to go, and so they just said, we're going to start at Kingsport, Tennessee, which is Long Island on the Holston River at the time, and then go to Boonesboro. And Danny Boone knew the way more than anybody else, and so he gathered up the guys. And
of course, when they came, there were some of the families that got discouraged and turned around and went back.
But in 1775, Danny Boone did something really important. A lot of people don't know about it. And he opened the very first road ever. It's the very first road. It's kind of hard to get your mind around that this was the very first road in this part of the world. It wasn't even Kentucky at the time. But they blazed this little trail in the months of March and April 1775, and it was just a bridle path. It was the very first road ever to come on this side of the mountains. So you had the Revolutionary War going on in 1775. over in the east, and then you have the mountains, and then the only way to get through here was through the Cumberland Gap. Daniel Boone blazed this little trail. It's a huge historical significance, not only the founding of Kentucky, which was in 1792, but also it opened up the entire West. And it was then, on they came. And people came in by the thousands, and they literally came down this very little road right here, which is just incredible that we've got an actual piece of that road. It was the very first into Kentucky.
How important it is for farmers like this to keep in mind the historical importance of this and the preservation of that for the local farmer, the local landowner?
Well, we found several segments. This is one of the best, but there's several segments, and any place we find one, you know, it's not the longest. It's not a full, complete section of it, but it's a significant section. We got to save all of those. It's never gonna, in other words, it's never gonna get any better than it is right now. Maybe it's not the best now, but it's never gonna get any better. So whatever we've got to preserve what's left of it, and in perpetuity. You know, we've got to keep it so that it'll be here for good. So that's what we're trying to do, is set it up so that it'll be not only for our generation, but for all the future generations.
Now, how specifically when did you learn about this piece of the road here? I think that happened recently.
Well, I've been working on this 7 years, and I've come up here many times. The Lackey Airport is on the other side. There is a fellow who's now in his almost 90, Neil Hammond, who surveyed this, studied the surveys of the original surveyors that came through here in the late 1700s. I mean, these would be like 1790 surveys. And he was able to take those surveys and put them on modern maps, and then actually they would use, on their surveys, they'd use the portion of the trace as a reference point. And so he was able to adjust that to the maps and then kind of draw it where it came. And he's got a map that shows it came right through the old Lackey Airport and down to Hayes Fork Creek, which is right down the hill. And so he just drew those out, and he's too old now to go out and explore, but there have been people like me that come along and look for little pieces of it along his initial alignment. And we just lucked onto this one just out of like a gift from heaven. And this looks to be a real legitimate piece of it. I'm real grateful for that. Feeling when you get on these old roads, Boone Trace is not just a road. It's a spiritual thing. And when I'm doing these things, sometimes I'll just stop, and this is one of the places where you can do that, where you just stop and be quiet for about 15 seconds. And you'll literally get the feeling of, you'll hear the voices and see the faces of the people that came right through here. So just 10 seconds, just be quiet for a second. Kind of hear the leather creaking and
The water running.
tinkling and the water running and birds chirping. But there's a spiritual feeling you get right here. Well, we're in the process trying to make it into a trail people could walk and hike and everything, but it's private land and people have to be willing to kind of do that sort of thing. They could make an easement, you know, in perpetuity kind of easement, or if there's permission that can be granted through the state to do that sort of thing. But the primary thing is that he's aware of it, and he seems to be aware of it, and I hope that if he ever decides to sell it, there'll be some kind of easement written into the deed that says it'll be preserved. That's our main thing, is we just want to save what's left, and no matter what we do. We think by making it into a trail that you can hike or drive near and maybe drop in and walk a little bit of it would help to preserve it. But the main thing is preserving it. Over here, but you can see where it's kind of shelled out here. Right. This is the road. This is it right here.
Look at these old stones, how long they've been.
Yeah.
240 years.
Well, this, of course, as Dr. Fox said, the real entry into Kentucky and the American West back in the late 1700s. And we're, of course, interested in any historical sites that we can find in the county, and in particular the Boone Trace, since it was the entry for all the settlers and pioneers that came in. It's extremely important. And there's several places in the county where the original trace can be almost 100% identified, and this is one of them. And so we're very grateful to Don and Betsy for, calling that to our attention, and talking to John about being able to incorporate that into the overall, we'll call it the plan of the Boone Trace in modern days. It's a very important part because it is almost 100% certain that it's part of the trace. And we only have a few really pristine locations in the county. This one, of course, when you come across Boone Gap at the Rock Castle County line, that's obviously part of it. And then you go down just the other side of Lake Reba and down Otter Creek, and there's a section down there that's pretty certainly part of the trace. It aligns with all the information that Dr. Hammond created back several decades ago, and it still looks that way. This has, as Dr. Fox says, a little bit of a place in the heart, because one of my great-grandfathers was on the axe team with Boone, and David Gass was here when they went through. The numbers of people that came in from the time it was opened in 1775 through the early 1800s could have been up in the 200,000 plus range, and so that's a heck of a lot of different families. And of course the families were large, so you may have been bringing in 6 or 8 or 10 people per family, but that's still a huge number of families. And in Madison County we've got so many people that are still living here who have descendants that go back to the earliest days. And the Society of Boonesboro, which has membership with people who can trace their ancestry to Boonesboro, has over the period of time it's been in existence since the late 1970s, has had 700 or 800 people, different families that have been tied to the settlers. Colonials decided it was time to move out of the coastal states. There were 2 ways of getting into what was the American West at that time. One was coming down the Ohio River on barges and then hopping off and coming through the wilderness somewhere. And they did that a lot. They had a harbor or a getting off point at Maysville. Some of them came all the way down to Cincinnati or to Louisville and got off. But the other way in that a large percentage of the people used was coming through the Cumberland Gap. They'd come down through western Virginia and then come across the Cumberland Gap, and they had several different avenues to go once they got across the gap. Boone Trace, of course, came pretty much due north to Boonesboro. But following that same general alignment, you had a couple of other traces, and eventually the Wilderness Road was built. And not to confuse the Wilderness Road and Boone Trace. I've listened to John Fox and I've got that down. The Wilderness Road kind of wove back and forth parallel to the trace up until it got to the Hazel Patch, and then it swung and went northwest to Stanford, Harrodsburg, and on to Louisville. And it more or less followed Skaggs Trace, which was one of the earliest trails in that direction. The total number of people estimated to come through the gap and then take one of these roads or paths or traces into Kentucky and other parts west. We're in the neighborhood of 48 million people.
This is Hayes Fork Creek here, and Hayes Fork connects with Harts Fork, which connects with Taylor's Fork.
Now Silver Creek.
And all branches of Silver Creek.
Right.
And that's where they camped at a place called Twitty's Fort, which is up south of Richmond. But this is an obvious connection with Hayes Fork to Harts Fork. It's right over there. And they picked up Harts Fork and headed on up.
Harts Fork, almost 2 miles down the creek.
2 miles.
Almost, yeah, I wonder. Well, there's this bluff, and it's bluff up and down the creek both ways.
Both sides here.
Both sides bluff,
Yeah.
so there couldn't be no other crossing. And get on down the creek where you can cross the creek, and it's bluff on the opposite sides, so they couldn't have went up that way. This has been the only way where it's not a bluff on both sides.
Plus he gets that feeling. Right?
Yeah.
You get that feeling?
Oh yeah.
Grandpa. Grandpa's on this road. This very road right here. This little piece of dirt right here.